Hi, I'm Rosie, Head of NPD at Atom Brands, and today I'm going to be talking to you all about bottling and closures. So as a producer, you spend your days pouring your passion into what you do, incredible liquids that you're proud to share with the world. But what happens when all of that hard work is put at risk because the packaging just isn't fit for purpose? So the consumer experience can potentially be affected massively if they can't get into the bottle or if it's damaged. The enjoyment of your product can be tainted, the physical enjoyment, but also their memory of your product as well. So there are a multitude of things to consider, from which markets you're shipping to, how the product's being used, and of course, more recently, sustainability. So corks are a really important part of any spirit, and it doesn't have to be a cork. It could be a screw cap, it can be any type of closure. And when I talk about closure, I'm talking about the bit that actually stops the liquid coming into contact with the air. So it can be a cork or a screw cap or whatever. So natural cork. I mean, there's something really, really romantic and unmistakable about a natural cork, right? That sound, it's something that we all know and love, and it's romantic, it's evocative, it makes you feel, and I personally associate it really closely with Scotch whiskey, but as we know, cork taint and TCA is a thing. Although it's less common in spirits, nobody wants their spirit to taste of cork, and even in white spirits and gin and vodka, you might not be able to taste it, but you can see it, and nobody wants their product to be sort of discoloured, because from an aesthetic standpoint it can be really unpleasant. You have synthetic corks, which have the benefit of being completely man-made. You don't get cork taint, but they're not as romantic. They're definitely cheaper to produce, and you can guarantee that your spirit will stay unaffected from a colour and taste point of view and completely intact. However, be mindful of using a synthetic cork. Because of their makeup, they're harder than natural corks, which means that when you push it into a bottle, it's got less give. So it's really important to do really, really good testing with these, making sure you're finding the right cork for the right product. Because if it doesn't go in enough, then obviously it pops, and it could potentially not seal the bottle properly. And obviously if it's too small, you get interaction with the air and the cork and everything, and that increases the chance of it being damaged or you getting cork taint. So there's a trade-off versus natural and synthetic. But then also you've got microagglomerate. So these are constructed from uniform sized microgranules, and they have the same look and feel as natural cork, but they're much more cost effective. Now, the only downside from my point of view on these is the fact that because they're not made out of cork, they have to be sort of glued together. Cork's completely biodegradable. It's sort of quite sustainable. Economically, it's an option and it's great. With microagglomerate, it's glued together. So already you're introducing something which isn't sustainable to a sustainable product. Now, it's all a trade-off, right? I'm not saying you have to be absolutely sustainable. You know, all of these things are a trade-off. It depends what you want to achieve. So glue is quite an important thing with corks, especially T-stops as well. You have to make sure that your supplier is using that glue that's really, really good, because you don't want your bit on the top here to just break off, because then you have to get a corkscrew in. And I don't know if you've ever tried to remove a synthetic cork with a corkscrew. It's really, really, really hard to do because they're so dense and they're so plasticky. And that again is just, as a consumer, you want to be able to get into this amazing product that you've bought. You don't want to have to mess around with a corkscrew and do this and get the kitchen knife out and slice your hand open, because your memory of that product will be how difficult it was to actually get into it to enjoy. So there are a number of trade-offs when you're looking at how to close your bottle. The other important thing as well is with a screw cap or something which isn't sort of pushed in, you might need to invest in machinery for that as well. So whilst you might think, okay, I don't want to use a cork, there's so many things that can go wrong, I just want to use a screw cap, that's fine, but you have to look into where you're going to have to spend elsewhere, because you need special machinery to apply certain things. Whereas with a cork, it's very easy to do it by hand, you can do it by machinery, you've got many, many options, but some things require a bigger sort of spend to begin with to be able to set you up to do that within your infrastructure. So closures, this is in my mind what goes over the cork. So you've got a screw cap, or you've got cork, or you've got anything basically which stops the liquid coming in contact with the air, then the thing that goes over that. Now you can use these for many reasons. What's more important to you? Is it cost, sustainability, minimum order quantities, brand identity, the investment that you need to set it up, or does it need to be tamper evident? So some of the options are really sustainable, some are really cheap. Others are not sustainable and the costs are very high, but the product may need to be really premium. So maybe it's a stopper where you will keep that bottle and you'll use it as a decanter or something. In that situation, you might want to spend a bit more. And it might not be sustainable, but it doesn't really matter because it's not really going back into that supply chain. Others are really cheap to produce and are sustainable, but require hand finishing, which obviously increases labour costs. So you've got a multitude of things which you can choose from. You can use a PVC or a PET heat shrink, which is sort of like shrunk on like this. You can use a polylaminate, which is a combination of aluminium and polyethylene. So you see these more on sort of high volume lines. These generally tend to be a roll-on or potentially a heat shrink, depending on how it's applied. You can use a tin foil, which is essentially rolled on. It's a foil, generally tends to be made of aluminium, I think. And then you have the option of, paper bandoliers as well. So this is quite a nice option where you've got a screw cap and you don't want to use plastic. So that's something we use quite a lot, which is quite a nice tamper evident option, but it may not be something that you want to move into scale when you're doing slightly like larger volumes. But as I said, it needs to be hand applied, so that increases labour costs. You've also got wax as well, which there are a number of reasons why you would use wax. It looks beautiful. It has really, really nice finish to it. However, just be mindful of how you get it up, how you get it off. And also where it's going as well. Do you need a pull tab to be able to get that into that product? How does that impact your cost? How does that impact which closure you use? If you choose to use a wax for whatever reason, just make sure that you're thinking about all the other things that go alongside it. Like, you can use wax, it can look great, but can the customer actually get into it? And then the last one I'm going to talk about, which is something I don't really have a lot of experience in, but I'm really, really interested to see where it goes, is sort of the more sustainable from the off options. So things like cellulose. I haven't tried to use it personally. Some of the feedback I've got from people who have used it have said it can be quite messy. You need to get it wet first and then apply it and then dry it somehow. Haven't tried to use it personally, as I said, but at scale I can imagine this being quite a tricky thing to implement into the sort of the production of your product, but I'm really interested to see how this sort of moves and grows as the years sort of go on, because it is something which is talked about, I talk about daily, in terms of sustainability, and not just making sure your products can be recycled, but actually being really clever about where it comes from, and just mindful of not just getting something because it's recyclable, because where does that energy come from in the first place? So cellulose and plant-based stuff is something which I think we'll see probably quite a lot of growth in, and I'm really excited to see where that goes. So just going back to the subject of wax seals as well, this is something that it's taken quite a long time to understand exactly where you need to get to. So it's about using the right wax pots. Do your research, make sure that you find the wax pot that's right for you, not only in terms of its operating standards, but also in terms of the volume. If you're only doing a small number of bottles and you don't need a massive amount of wax, don't get a massive wax pot, because you need to keep it full all the time. It's all about understanding what your product's going to be, how you're going to package your product, no volumes and all that sort of thing, and also really, really, really get into the nitty-gritty with your supplier. What should the melting point be to get that level of sort of opacity or sort of density of the wax you want? How shiny should it be? It's really worth having a really good relationship with your supplier, so you can fully understand what the tolerances are within what you can do. Whether it's so colour wax might act in a completely different way to black wax, just generally because of the density of the pigment in the color. So if you get something like pale pink wax, you might need to dip it at a lower temperature So the wax is slightly thicker, whereas a black, you could probably go slightly higher in terms of temperature because the density of the pigment's more. So there's no black and white answer or black and pink answer. It's understanding exactly what you want your product to look like and how it's being used. And the best advice I can give you is really lean on your suppliers and build that relationship, because they want your product to be the best it can be, and they're more than likely always willing to help you get there. So next we're going to talk a little bit about filling your bottles and vacuity. So when you fill a bottle, you have some headspace. So this is really important as it keeps the whole product intact throughout its journey to the consumer. So headspace is also referred to as vacuity. So as standard, the suggestion is that the vacuity should be no less than 3.5% of the volume of the bottle after cork. So basically, if you don't have that, you run the risk of that headspace decreasing. As the liquid expands when it gets warmer, that headspace decreases, and then the weakest point of the bottle, which is generally the cork, will pop. Now, someone said to me, well, can't you just make sure that the cork doesn't pop, use a screw cap or something like that? And what happens when this isn't the weakest point anymore? What happens when this is the weakest point or this is the weakest point? Then the bottle smashes in transit. And I think that has probably got to be so much worse than just your cork popping, right? Because all of a sudden you've got 70 cl liquid or whatever in a box, as opposed to the corks popping and some evaporating. It's a lot less mess and a lot less heartache. But I'll be honest, if you're not shipping globally, probably isn't going to be so much of an issue for you right now. If you're not shipping containers, places like Dubai, where it's going to be 45 degrees for 4 hours, then it's probably not going to be so much of a problem. But it's worth ironing out these issues before you get to that point. If you spent 5 years building a really strong brand identity and you've got a bottle mold made and everything, and then you find out your vacuity is only 1.5% and you want to ship it to South Africa and you don't want to use a refrigerated container, then you're going to have so many problems down the line and heartache. So it really is worth looking at those things before you get to that point, rather than working out that you need a new bottle mold and it's going to take 9 months to produce it and you miss an order for South Africa or Australia. So there's a number of things you can do to make your life a lot easier sort of further down the line. This also sort of highlights the importance of filling to the correct level, also obviously in line with all your weights and measures checks. If you overfill, not only are you essentially sort of giving away extra liquid, but you run the risk of decreasing the percentage of vacuity and the risk of sort of popping bottles. And there's no legal ramifications for overfilling. You can do it, as long as you don't make any claims about the overfilling and it's not being done to avoid duty payment, i.e. rebottling after the duty is paid on the lower volume. For me, it's just not great business sense. Why would you give away something for free? There's no legal ramifications, but actually what it can do is it can impact the integrity of your product when it gets to the consumer. No one wants a popping bottle at the wrong time. So when we talk about weights and measures checks as well, it's also worth touching on temperature, because liquid contracts and expands at different temperatures. In a cooler environment, it's going to be lower in the bottle. Say you bottle somewhere like a garage or somewhere that's outdoors, hasn't got, or near outdoors and hasn't got very much heating. If you're bottling at 12 degrees in the middle of winter, you're going to get volume wise less in, it will look like less in the bottle because of the temperature you've bottled at. And then when it goes into someone's house, 23, 26 degrees, that liquid will expand quite a lot. And that obviously impacts your filling and sort of how that sort of fills the bottle. And so that's why it's really important when you do your weights and measures checks to always do it at I think 20 degrees is the standard, just to make sure that you're definitely putting the right amount of liquid in your bottle. I mean, this is all parts of weights and measures anyway for the UK market, but it's worth, even if you are bottling in a cooler environment or a warmer environment in the middle of summer in the south of France or something, it's worth making sure that all these things are taken into account. You can obviously chill or sort of raise the temperature when you're doing the bottling, caveat being, you know, this equipment costs money, but you will need to make sure that your weights and measures checks are complete anyway, just from a compliance point of view. So we will generally have something in place to ensure that whenever you're filling at a certain temperature, you know what the tolerance is on that. So I guess the key takeaways here are, it really depends what you want to do with your product. Which boxes are you trying to tick? Are you trying to make sure that everything's sustainable, or do you want something that's really premium, or do you want something that's cost effective? You can do all of those things, just make sure it's really fit for purpose. Through a combination of sort of testing, really building that rapport with your suppliers and also with your customers as well, like how is your product being used? And really, you've got to really get into the nitty-gritty of understanding the complete journey of your product. And after all, you have put your heart and soul into it, right? And we want to take the consumer on that journey, and we want to give them the superb user experience exactly as you intended it.